Hello and welcome to Wetzel Wisdom. This is day 1 of my full AZ-104 course. We'll work through one exam topic a day, each with a lecture and a hands-on lab, and the whole thing is free to follow. Today we're talking about Microsoft Entra ID, the identity service behind Azure and Microsoft 365, and the start of the biggest chunk of your exam, worth roughly 20 to 25%. For today, we'll figure out what Entra ID actually is, how it's different from regular Active Directory, and then tenants and subscriptions, the 3 additions, and a strange cousin called Entra Domain Services. Now before we get started, I have to make a quick disclaimer about Entra. It used to be called Azure AD, and it was renamed in 2023. But you may still come across various AZ104 resources that refer to Entra as Azure AD. Just know that they're the same exact product, and the only thing that changed was the name. So what is Microsoft Entra ID? Well, it's an identity service that lives in the cloud. Microsoft runs it, patches it, and you just use it from anywhere with nothing but a web browser. In cloud terms, it's a platform as a service, which means you never install anything, you never maintain anything, and you never even see the servers that it runs on. To help give you a better understanding, let me show you what came before it, because the reason Entra ID exists is the most important thing in this whole video. Here's a company about 20 years ago. Inside the building, there's a Windows server running something called Active Directory Domain Services. In this video, I will just call it AD. That domain controller holds the user accounts, the passwords, and the groups. And every employee at this company sits at a desk on the company network just a few milliseconds from that server. They sign in, the domain controller answers, and the whole exchange is instant. The network is trusted, and everything lives inside these 4 walls. And for something like the 90s and the early 2000s, that worked okay. So what changed since then is everything outside of that building. People started working from coffee shops, or from their phones, from their home, from client offices. And the apps that they use stopped living on the company server. They're cloud apps now, running in someone else's data center. Take notice of the diagram that we're building here. The domain controller is stuck inside that network boundary behind the firewall, and the users and the apps are all out here. Unless there were VPNs in place, AD was never built for any of this. So then came Entra ID. Different product, different protocols, and a different problem. Everything outside the on-premise boundary signs in through this cloud service instead. Just keep in mind that Entra ID is not Active Directory hosted in the cloud. It's a separate product solving a separate problem, and the exam tests that distinction constantly. So Entra ID has 3 jobs. They're on screen, but let me put them in plain English. First, it manages who you are. Every person in every group and every device gets a record in the directory. Second, it controls what you can get into. Single sign-on means you log in once and every app trusts it. MFA stands for multi-factor authentication and typically requires a second form of authentication in order to sign in, such as a text, push, or even a passcode. Conditional access is a rule that looks at the sign-in before it decides anything. It asks questions like, who's signing in? What device are they on? Where are they? Does the sign-in look risky? And then from those questions, it lets them in, blocks them, or asks for more verification. Thirdly, Entra connects identity across systems. Federation sounds weird, but it just means that 2 systems are agreeing to trust each other's logins, so your people don't need a second account. Syncing with on-prem AD is the same idea, pointed at the directory you already run. One more thing before we move on. Every new Azure subscription comes with a free Entra tenant. Microsoft names this the default directory. So if your company runs something like Microsoft 365 or Intune, you're already using Entra ID. Okay, so now we know why Entra ID exists. Let's see how it's actually different from Active Directory. There are 5 differences worth knowing for the exam. We'll fill in this table together, and for each row, we'll explain why the difference exists. Okay, let's get into the environment. AD assumes that you're on the company network. That assumption is baked in everywhere. It finds domain controllers with internal DNS, and it uses ports that firewalls block at the internet edge. If you want to use it from outside the office, you have no choice but to use a VPN. Entra assumes the exact opposite. Everything Entra does happens over HTTPS on port 443. Coincidentally, that's the same port that your browser uses to load any web page. So why build it that way? Well, think about it. If Entra needed a VPN, that would kill the whole point. The pitch of Entra is that your identity is supposed to work from anywhere, and that anywhere is typically over a web browser, which uses HTTPS. Now let's talk about structure. Active Directory is a true directory service. It's a tree based on the X500 standard. It's got forests at the top, domains inside the forest, and then organizational units inside the domains. You drop a user in an OU, you link a group policy object to it, and the user inherits that policy. On the flip side, Entra has none of that. The directory is flat, with no OUs, no GPOs. Entra ID doesn't even have computer objects. It uses something called device objects. And these devices connect to Entra in a completely different way than computers join a domain. So why is this structure so different from Active Directory? Well, in the cloud, you don't need one. In Entra, you would scope policy with groups and conditional access based on attributes. Again, you'd be asking questions like, what kind of user is this? What kind of device is this? Where is this device? And what risk level? And when you use these attributes, it becomes way more flexible than deciding where someone sits in a folder structure or on a tree. In regard to authentication, Active Directory mostly authenticates with Kerberos, with NTLM as the old fallback. Both are great protocols on the network they were built for, but both fall apart the second you leave it. Entra ID uses web protocols instead. For example, there's SAML, WS Federation, and OpenID Connect, which all handle authentication. These three prove who you are. OAuth handles authorization. That's what you're allowed to do once you're in. These protocols were built for the open internet. That's why you can sign into something like Outlook from a phone in an airport with nothing but a web browser. When we're dealing with many users and computer objects, we need to be able to query through to find specific information. So with Active Directory, they get queried over something called LDAP. Unfortunately, Entra ID doesn't support LDAP at all. Instead, it gives you a REST API over HTTPS called Microsoft Graph API. This is a very basic one or the other difference, but it does get tested constantly. If you ever see a question where something like a developer can't query Entra with LDAP tools, the answer is always the same. Entra does not speak LDAP. Instead, Entra uses Graph. Lastly, let's move on to management. Active Directory is managed with group policy. Entra ID is managed with conditional access policies and groups. These both have the same goal. We want to apply policy to lots of users and devices at once. The difference is that conditional access evaluates in real time. It checks where the user is, what device they're on, and whether the sign-in looks risky. Group policy checks once at login and assumes the world doesn't change. So the takeaway here is that Active Directory and Entra don't replace each other. I'd say that the majority of companies actually run them side by side. They'll typically have something like on-prem Active Directory for the machines in the building, and once those machines are registered with a domain, they would get joined to Entra. This combo that I'm talking about is called hybrid identity, and it'll come back over and over in this course. Okay, this section is less drawn out, but it's still key for building our exam knowledge. An Entra tenant is your organization's own private copy of Entra ID. When your company signed up for Azure or Microsoft 365, Entra set aside a directory just for you, and that directory is your tenant. It holds your users, your groups, and your apps, and no one else can see into it, even though every tenant in the world runs on the same shared infrastructure. Every tenant gets a default domain name. It looks something like yourcompany.onmicrosoft.com. Most organizations start with this, and then they add a custom domain on top, like wetzelwisdom.com. Now here's a relationship you have to memorize, and we're going to build this piece by piece. Again, we have an Entra tenant, one directory with all your users, groups, and policies. Now here is an Azure subscription. If you studied the AZ-900 before, you know that a subscription is tied to one tenant. But flip it around and one tenant can serve many subscriptions. Many subscriptions can belong in one tenant. This one-to-many relationship can get kind of confusing, but once you understand why it's designed this way, it makes a lot of sense. Let's say it was the other way around, and you only had one subscription with multiple tenants. If this was the case, then your employees would need 3 accounts, each. If you were to promote a staff member, you'd have to update 3 places. If you want to offboard staff, you'd have to update 3 places again. And simply put, Microsoft refused to build that world. So instead, subscriptions handle billing, and the tenant handles identity. You could have as many subscriptions as you or your finance team wants, and you could point them all at one tenant, and your users and policies just follow. And it goes past Azure too. This same tenant is the identity layer for every Microsoft Cloud service you see. Stuff like Microsoft 365, Intune, Dynamics, all of them sign in against this one directory. If you were to get a test question that asks how to, let's say, share users across multiple subscriptions, the answer would typically be to associate them all with the same Entra tenant. Okay, so through this course, I like to show demos of how to do things or what things are. So what we're looking at right now is the Entra Admin Center at entra.microsoft.com. There's the tenant name and the ID, which is a unique ID you'll see all over Azure. And then there's also the default domain we just talked about. You can also get into Entra from Azure, so watch this. We're in the same browser, but now on a different site. We're in Azure at portal.azure.com. If I were to use the search bar at the top to search for Entra ID, it comes up and I could click on it. When we're looking at it from Azure, it's the same Entra tenant, but it's just a different way of getting to it. Don't worry so much about clicking along right now, this is just a preview. In the lab video, you'll actually build your own tenant and stand in the same exact spot. Additionally, here's your first command card, and let me explain these real quick. The AZ-104 is not a click the portal exam. Microsoft expects an Azure administrator to work in 3 places: the portal, PowerShell, and the Azure CLI, also called Bash. So you're going to see that all 3 show up on the test. You might get a block of PowerShell and be asked what it does. You might get questions where there's a portal answer and a command answer. Both are on the list and one of them actually works. And yes, having an AZ-104 is nice, but when you have infrastructure as code skills, that looks even better on your resume. I plan to have it so that every lecturer in this course ends their demo with one of these command cards. These cards are going to show you the commands and some of the syntax. By the last day of our course, you should have seen enough of these, or at least I hope you've seen enough of these, to get the same patterns and be able to understand them when they come up on the exam. So on the left, we have PowerShell. Connect-mg graph signs you in. Get-mg organization shows your tenant. On the right, we have the same equivalent commands, but in the Azure CLI. There's AZ login and AZ account shell. Now, don't try to memorize these yet, because we'll cover all that on tomorrow's video. Tomorrow, we'll be covering the portal, Cloud Shell, PowerShell, and Bash, and it teaches you the grammar that these commands are built from. What I'm trying to get at here is that everything in the portal, every button that you see, has a command version, and the exam might show you these commands and ask for proper syntax or ask what these commands even do. Alright, let's move on to licensing. Entra ID comes in 3 editions. There's free, P1, and P2. I'm sure you can assume that features are locked behind tiers of licenses, and that's correct. The exam loves to describe a feature and then ask what tier you need. The free tier of Entra is the bare minimum you need to use Microsoft's cloud at all. It provides you with users, groups, and a sign-in. And of course, there's a reason why it's free. If Microsoft were to charge for the users, groups, and sign-in, then that means that no one could use 365 or even Azure without paying on day 1. Now, P1 is where Microsoft starts charging. You don't need to know the price for the exam, but you just need to know what comes with it. The first thing that comes with it is conditional access. And again, as we described before, it examines your sign-in. For example, you can configure it so that if a user signs in from an unfamiliar country, then require MFA. If there's a setting on their device that's preventing them from being compliant, then block any sign-ins from that device. The bottom line here is that if you see anything about restricting access by device, group, location, or risk, that's conditional access, and that's served on P1. Additionally, P1 gives you something called self-service password reset with write-back. That is a mouthful, but let me explain the problem that it solves. So, in a hybrid setup, a user resets their password in the cloud, but the on-prem domain controller never gets the memo. By default, it's not able to get that new password that the user set in the cloud. So when that user goes to sign in on their work laptop, it fails. The new password fails at least. Write-back is something that closes that loop. It takes a new password and it syncs it back down to on-prem AD. What's also nice is that self-service reset follows the on-prem AD password policy. So for example, if you have a requirement to have 8 characters, a symbol, and number on your domain controller, you can guarantee that both requirements are going to be the same from your domain controller and your Entra tenant. P1 also has better MFA. It has self-service group management, Connect Health, and some other things, but I don't think these are actually tested on the exam, but it's just worth saying it. Now P2 has everything in P1, plus a couple features built around cybersecurity. Firstly, you get Entra ID protection. ID protection uses all the data from the billions of sign-ins that Microsoft gets every week to score every sign-in for risk. Risky stuff would be like leaked passwords, impossible travel, sketchy anonymous networks, that type of stuff. With ID protection, you would set risk policies that respond on their own. You can either block a sign-in, force MFA, or flag the sign-in for review. So for the exam, if a scenario shows automatic response to risky sign-ins, that's ID protection and that's on P2. Secondly, P2 gets something called Privilege Identity Management, or PIM for short. In many examples of breaches, it usually happens with someone who steals credentials from an account with permanent admin rights, all the access you would need. With PIM, that model of permanent access is killed. Admin roles are no longer permanent. Technicians and staff would use PIM to activate roles when they need them. These roles would get activated for a limited time and maybe with an approval. So again, for the exam questions, if a scenario shows limited time access with approvals, that's PIM and that's served on P2. Let me try to boil this whole thing down into a shortcut. If it's something that controls access based on conditions, it's P1. If it responds to risk automatically or grants admin rights just in time, it's P2. Now there's a third product in this family called Microsoft Entra Domain Services, and I'm going to do my best to explain it. It really isn't that important, but the exam loves to dangle it as a wrong answer. Do you remember our diagram from section 1? The world moved to the cloud, and Entra ID serves that world with web protocols. But here's the thing. In some rare cases, companies still run older apps that never got the memo. These apps would use stuff like Kerberos or NTLM to sign people in. They also query the directory over LDAP. These older apps are built just for domain joined machines and group policy. Now let's say your company wants to move one of these apps into Azure, and we just spent a whole section saying that Entra ID speaks none of those protocols. It doesn't do NTLM, and it doesn't do LDAP either. So what do? Let's picture it real quick. Here's a legacy app now on a VM in Azure. It needs a domain controller to talk to, and there's 3 roads. Road 1 is to build a site-to-site VPN from Azure back to your on-prem domain controllers. It technically works, but now every sign-in crosses that VPN, and if the link goes down, your app stops signing people in. Road 2 is to put replica domain controllers on the VMs in Azure. It's better because sign-ins stay in the cloud and only replication crosses the VPN. But now you're back to patching, monitoring, and guarding domain controllers, which, not to mention, is exactly the work that cloud was supposed to take off your plate. Then there's Road 3, which is Entra Domain Services. It's a managed domain that Microsoft runs and it's wired to your Entra tenant. Your virtual network gets real domain services, such as domain join, group policy, Kerberos, NTLM, and LDAP, and you never have to touch a domain controller. In terms of cost, it bills by the hour based on your directory size. Now it does have its limits, and they show up on the exam too. Such limits would be the OU structure being flat, there's no nested OUs, and you can't extend the schema. And lastly, group policy only gives you the built-in GPOs. So Entra Domain Services is not a full replacement for on-prem AD. It's there to become a bridge for older workloads. Okay, and with that, we have a comparison between 2 major products and 1 minor product. Entra is cloud identity using only web protocols. Active Directory is a full traditional directory that you run yourself. And then Entra Domain Services is a managed AD compatible domain for legacy apps in Azure. On the exam, you would figure out which problem the scenario actually has and then pick the matching product. To give you a quick shortcut, if you see something like Kerberos, LDAP, or group policy in Azure with no domain controllers to manage, that's Entra Domain Services. Hopefully that better explains it. Okay, let's sum it all up before the quiz. First, we started with why Entra ID exists. Active Directory was built for people at desks on a trusted internal network. The world moved to remote work and cloud apps. So Microsoft built a new identity service for the internet. And remember, Entra ID is not Active Directory hosted in the cloud. Then we filled in 5 rows on a table. Internal network versus internet over HTTPS. A tree with OUs versus flat with groups. Kerberos and NTLM versus SAML, Federation, OpenID Connect, and OAuth. LDAP versus Graph API. And group policy versus conditional access. After that table, we talked about tenants and subscriptions. A tenant is your organization's own copy of Entra ID. It's also the identity layer for all your Microsoft Cloud services. A subscription belongs exactly to one tenant, while one tenant serves many subscriptions. Then there's licensing. Free would give you users, groups, and sign-in. P1 adds conditional access and password write-back. P2 adds ID protection and PIM. Conditional access is P1, while risk response or just-in-time admin is P2. And lastly, Entra Domain Services, a managed domain that gives older apps in Azure their Kerberos, LDAP, and group policy, with the benefit of no domain controllers for you to run. It comes at the cost of flat OUs, no schema changes, and built-in GPOs only. Okay, before we jump into the quiz, quick note. The 4 questions we're about to do are a sample. I built a free site for this course at wetzelwisdom.com, and there's 2 things on it you should know about. Firstly, there's free AZ104 labs. This is the part that I'm proudest of. Reading about Azure won't get you through this exam. You have to build things, break them, and put them back so you can develop skills needed to answer most questions. So the labs are free and run as a browser extension. You can ask it for the steps, and it lists them right beside your web portal. It can deploy resources into your own Azure tenant, and it checks each step as you finish it, so you know what you did right instead of hoping. When you're done with the lab, one button tears the whole thing back down. Secondly, there's practice questions. There's spaced repetition flashcards, plus full-length time exams in the same format as a real AZ104. Labs and questions both free. Link is in the description. Okay, let's get into the quiz. Question 1. Your company has a single Microsoft Entra tenant with an existing subscription. You plan to add 2 new Azure subscriptions, one for development and one for production. The security team requires that all 3 subscriptions share the same user accounts, group memberships, and access policies. What should you do? A. Create a new Entra tenant for each subscription. B. Associate both new subscriptions with the existing Entra tenant. C. Enable Microsoft Entra Domain Services on both new subscriptions. Or D. Federate the new subscriptions with the existing tenant. Okay, the answer is B. As we covered in Section 3, one Entra tenant can support many Azure subscriptions. So the move is to point both new subscriptions at the existing tenant. Doing this would ensure that all 3 subscriptions get the same users, groups, and policies automatically. Answer A is wrong because new tenants do the exact thing that the security team is trying to avoid. They split identity across separate directories. Answer C is the trap. Entra Domain Services is the managed domain for legacy apps we covered in Section 5. It has nothing to do with sharing identity across subscriptions. And then answer D is wrong because federation is for trusting outside identity providers. You wouldn't federate to your own tenant. Question 2. A developer on your team can't query Microsoft Entra ID using the same LDAP tools they use against on-premise Active Directory. Which of the following is the correct explanation? A. LDAP is disabled by default, and Entra ID must be enabled by a global administrator. B. LDAP queries to Entra ID require a P1 or P2 license. C. Entra ID does not support LDAP. Queries use a Graph API over HTTPS. Or D. The developer must connect through a VPN to query Entra ID over LDAP. Okay, the answer is C. As we covered in Section 2, LDAP belongs to Active Directory. It's an internal network protocol. Entra ID is a cloud service, and you query it with the Microsoft Graph API over HTTPS. So in short, the developer needs to learn Graph. Answer choices A, B, and D are all built to look plausible to someone who didn't watch the whole video or didn't pay attention. There's no toggle for LDAP, and there's no license that adds LDAP either, and a VPN doesn't change the protocol. The bottom line is that Entra just doesn't speak LDAP ever. Question 3. Your security team has 2 requirements. Firstly, sign-ins flagged as high risk should automatically trigger a block or step-up authentication. Second, admin role access should be time limited and require approval before activation. Which tier of Entra ID licenses would you need? A. Free. B. P1. C. P2. And then D. P1 for the first requirement, P2 for the second. The answer is C. Both features are P2 only. The first requirement by the security team is Entra ID protection. That's the automatic risk scoring and response that we talked about earlier. The second is PIM. That's just-in-time admin roles with approval. Neither PIM or ID protection belong to P1. Answer D is a tempting trap. It tries to split the licensing across tiers, but ID protection isn't a P1 feature. Question 4. Your company is migrating a legacy line of business application from an on-premise data center to Azure virtual machines. The application authenticates users for Kerberos and queries the directory over LDAP. The IT director wants to retire all on-premises domain controllers and refuses to deploy or manage any domain controllers in Azure. What should you implement? A. Entra ID with Graph API. B. Entra Domain Services. C. Replica AD domain controllers on Azure virtual machines. Or D. A site-to-site VPN from Azure to the on-premise domain controllers. Okay, the answer is B. Entra Domain Services. The key phrases here are Kerberos, LDAP, and refuses to manage domain controllers. That's the exact problem that Entra Domain Services was built for. A managed domain gives you Kerberos, NTLM, LDAP, domain join, and group policy. And Microsoft runs it for you in Azure so you don't have to manage domain controllers. Answer A is wrong because Entra ID doesn't speak Kerberos or LDAP, and the IT director wasn't looking to rewrite a legacy app to use Graph overnight. Answer C is close and worth a second look because it would technically work. Domain controllers in Azure would sign into the app just fine. But here's the thing. The director refuses to manage domain controllers, and row 2 is nothing but managing domain controllers. For this course, I'm trying to build questions that are written like the exam, and the exam loves answers that would work, but ignore what the scenario asked for. Answer D is wrong twice over. It keeps the on-prem domain controllers that the director wants gone, and it sends every sign-in across a VPN. Alright, that's the theory, and thank you for sticking with me until this point. Now, let's talk about the labs in this course. Today's lab is going to be building the Azure environment that you'll use to build other labs on the following days. You'll see that throughout this course, I've tried my best to make labs where the resources would be free or low cost. And in today's lab, we're also going to build a guardrail that helps keep everything low cost. Specifically, that would be email and text alerts for your own custom budget. So if something does go wrong with these labs, and if anything ever starts costing you money, you'll know before it matters. Okay, that's all for this video on Entra ID. I hope it was helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.